Rome began as a small settlement on a river in central Italy, in a region it did not dominate, surrounded by neighbors who were richer, more sophisticated, and better established. There was nothing about its position that predicted anything. Roughly 700 years later, it controlled the entire Mediterranean coastline, from Britain to Egypt, an area holding perhaps a fifth of the world's population under a single administration. It then held that position, with interruptions, for centuries more, and the eastern half of it survived until 1453, meaning Rome as a political entity outlasted the invention of gunpowder artillery. How a minor Italian town managed that, and what eventually undid it, is the most examined question in European history, and it is worth being upfront that the answers remain argued over. Let's dig into this properly, because the rise is the harder part to explain and it gets far less attention than the fall. Early Rome is difficult to see clearly. The traditional founding date and the accounts of the early kings come from writers working centuries later, drawing on legend, family tradition, and material intended to explain existing institutions rather than record events. Archaeology indicates settlement on the site from the early 1st millennium BCE, developing into a city under the influence of the Etruscans to the north, who were the dominant regional power and considerably more advanced. What the Romans themselves believed about their origins mattered enormously, whatever its accuracy. The expulsion of the last king and the founding of the Republic, traditionally dated to the late 6th century BCE, produced a political culture with a deep aversion to monarchy and a set of institutions designed to prevent any individual accumulating permanent power. Magistracies were held for a single year. Most were held in pairs so each holder could block the other, and a former office holder returned to being a private citizen. That system shaped Roman politics for centuries and made the eventual concentration of power under the emperors a genuine constitutional crisis rather than a smooth transition. Let's talk about how the conquest actually worked too, because this represents the part that explains the scale. Rome's early expansion across Italy was slow, contested, and involved substantial defeats. What distinguished it was not battlefield brilliance. Roman armies lost frequently, sometimes catastrophically, but what happened afterwards. Rome absorbed rather than merely subjugating. Defeated Italian communities were typically brought into a network of treaties with varying degrees of obligation and privilege. And the crucial element was that these arrangements offered a path to Roman citizenship. That was highly unusual. Most ancient states treated citizenship as a closed inheritance, and extending it to defeated enemies was close to unthinkable. Rome did it repeatedly, incorporating former opponents into its own body of citizens. And over centuries, this extended progressively wider until an emperor eventually granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The practical effect was manpower. Italian allies supplied troops, and the pool Rome could draw on was vastly larger than any rivals. This is the mechanism behind the most striking feature of Roman warfare, the capacity to absorb devastating losses and keep fighting. During the war against Hannibal, Rome suffered defeats that destroyed enormous armies, including a single engagement at Cannae in which a Roman force was annihilated. Any comparable state would have negotiated. Rome raised new legions and continued, and eventually won by outlasting an opponent who never lost a major battle in Italy. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it explains the pattern that recurs throughout the rise. Rome's advantage was structural rather than tactical. It could lose repeatedly and still win the war because its system generated soldiers, money, and political will faster than its enemies could destroy them. Let's talk about who paid for all of this too, because the machinery described so far ran on labor that belongs at the center of any honest account rather than in a footnote. Roman society was built on enslavement, at a scale few societies have matched. Enslaved people worked mines, agricultural estates, workshops, and households, and they were acquired principally through warfare, with successful campaigns, delivering captives in enormous numbers. Conquest and the slave supply were directly linked, which meant the economy had a structural interest in continued war. Conditions varied enormously, and the worst of them were lethal. Mine labor in particular carried life expectancies measured in short periods. Agricultural gangs on large estates worked under overseers with the authority to inflict severe punishment. Household enslavement could involve less brutal conditions and included people performing skilled work as secretaries, physicians, teachers, and accountants, and none of that altered the fundamental fact that they were owned and could be sold, punished, or killed by their owners with little constraint. Manumission was more common in Rome than in many slave societies, and freed people could acquire citizenship, with their children born free citizens. That produced a substantial population of freedmen, some of whom became wealthy. And it did not make the system benign. It made it a mechanism that continually consumed new captives while releasing some of the existing ones. Uprisings occurred, and the largest of them are among the most remembered episodes of Roman history. Their suppression was deliberately brutal and publicly displayed, which indicates clearly how the system was maintained. Any account of Roman achievement that describes the roads, the aqueducts, and the legal code without naming who quarried the stone and worked the fields is describing half of it. Let's talk about what the army became too, because this represents the instrument that did the work. The Roman military evolved substantially across its history, from a citizen militia of property-owning men equipping themselves into a professional standing force of long-serving soldiers paid by the state. That transition, associated with reforms in the late Republic, had consequences nobody intended. Professional soldiers serving long terms under the same commander developed loyalty to that commander rather than to the state, particularly since it was the general who secured land and payment for veterans on discharge. Armies that belong to individuals rather than to institutions are an obvious danger to a republic, and the civil wars that consumed the late Republic were fought largely between commanders with personally loyal forces. The legions themselves were formidable for reasons beyond equipment. Roman warfare emphasized engineering. Armies built fortified camps every night on campaign, constructed siege works, bridged rivers, and cut roads. Discipline was severe and training constant. Logistics were taken seriously in a way that was uncommon, with supply arrangements that let armies operate far from home for extended periods. And the system was adaptive, repeatedly adopting equipment and tactics from defeated enemies. Let's talk about the building too, because this represents the most visible legacy and it rested on a specific technical advantage. Roman concrete was a real material innovation. Combining lime, volcanic ash, and aggregate produced a substance that set into artificial stone, could be poured into forms, and crucially would cure underwater, which made harbor construction possible on a scale nobody had managed. Structures built with it are still standing after 2,000 years, and researchers have identified features of its composition, including lime inclusions that appear to allow cracks to reseal, which help explain that durability. What that material enabled was scale. Aqueducts delivered water into cities across enormous distances on gradients maintained with remarkable precision, feeding fountains, baths, latrines, and industry. Bath complexes were public infrastructure and social institutions simultaneously. Drainage and sewer systems in major cities carried waste away, and the main sewer of Rome remained in use for a very long time. Amphitheaters, basilicas, warehouses, and apartment blocks all used the same construction methods. The apartment blocks deserve particular mention because they contradict the usual mental image. Most inhabitants of Rome did not live in villas with courtyards. They lived in multi-story rental buildings, frequently poorly built, prone to collapse and to fire, with upper floors cheapest and least safe. Contemporary writers complain about the noise, the rents, and the structural quality, and regulations attempted to cap building heights after repeated disasters. Urban Rome was crowded, loud, dirty, and dangerous, and it was also supplied with running water and public baths, which is a combination that would not recur in European cities for a very long time after it ended. Let's talk about the transition to Empire too, because this represents the point where the Republic destroyed itself. The problem was that a constitution designed for a city-state was governing a Mediterranean empire, and it did not scale. Conquest generated enormous wealth, and that wealth flowed to a small elite who bought up land, worked it with enslaved people captured in war, and displaced small-holding farmers who had formed the traditional basis of the army. Those displaced citizens moved to cities, creating an urban population dependent on grain distribution. Political competition among the elite intensified as the stakes grew, and the informal norms holding the system together eroded. Political violence entered Roman public life and escalated. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. A century of intermittent civil war followed, involving figures whose names became permanent shorthand for the collapse of republics. It ended when Octavian defeated his last rival and constructed a settlement that preserved the forms of the republic while concentrating actual power in himself. Taking the name Augustus, he held authority through an accumulation of offices and honors rather than a formal crown, and the arrangement worked because he was careful never to name what he had done. The empire that followed brought roughly 2 centuries of relative internal stability, sometimes called the Roman Peace, during which the Mediterranean was effectively a single economic zone. Trade moved freely, cities were founded and grew, and material living standards for many appear to have risen measurably before falling again later. The scale of the population involved is worth stating plainly, since abstractions about empires obscure it. Estimates for the empire's population at its height generally fall somewhere in the range of 50 to 70 million people, with Rome itself possibly reaching 1 million inhabitants, a size no European city would match again for well over a millennium. Feeding a city that large required grain fleets arriving continuously from Egypt and North Africa, and the administrative apparatus for managing that supply was one of the state's central functions. When those shipping routes were disrupted in the later period, the population of the city collapsed accordingly. Let's talk about what held it together too, because the mechanisms are more interesting than the conquest. Roads were built primarily for military movement and served everything else as a consequence. A common legal framework provided predictable rules across enormous distances, and Roman law became one of the empire's most durable exports, underpinning legal systems long afterwards. A shared currency and the absence of internal borders made long-distance trade practical. Cities were founded on a recognizable template with the same institutions and public buildings, and local elites were offered participation and status within the Roman system rather than being simply ruled. That last point is the recurring theme. Rome incorporated. Provincial families entered the Senate. Emperors came from Spain, North Africa, Syria, and the Balkans. Local gods were absorbed into Roman religious practice rather than suppressed. A system that offers ambitious people a stake generates fewer rebellions than one that offers them nothing. Let's talk about religion too, because this represents one of the largest transformations the empire underwent and one that outlasted it entirely. Traditional Roman religion was a matter of practice rather than belief, correct performance of rituals, sacrifices, and festivals that maintained the relationship between the community and its gods. It was not exclusive. Absorbing the deities of conquered peoples was standard, and identifying foreign gods with Roman equivalents was routine. Cults from Egypt, Persia, and Asia Minor spread widely through the empire, carried along the same roads and trade routes as everything else. Christianity emerged within that environment and differed from it in a way that generated conflict. Its exclusivity meant adherents would not participate in the sacrifices and observances that Roman practice treated as basic civic duty, including those associated with the emperor. That refusal was read as a threat to the relationship between the state and the divine. And persecutions occurred at intervals, varying enormously in intensity and geographic reach. Popular accounts have generally exaggerated their consistency. They were episodic rather than continuous, and often locally driven. The reversal came in the 4th century, when Constantine legalized Christian worship and extended imperial favor to the church, and later emperors made Christianity the official religion and restricted traditional practice. Why Constantine did this is argued over, with explanations ranging from personal conviction to political calculation about a growing and well-organized constituency. The consequence was that when Western imperial administration failed, the church remained. It had a hierarchy modeled partly on imperial administrative divisions, it held property, It maintained literacy and record-keeping, and it operated across the territories the empire had governed. A substantial part of what continued after Rome continued through that institution, including the Latin language, aspects of Roman law, and the classical texts that monastic copying preserved. Let's talk about the fall too, because it is where the popular account is most misleading. The conventional date of 476, when the last emperor in the West was deposed, marks something far less dramatic than it sounds. The individual removed controlled a fragment of Italy. Real power in the West had passed to Germanic commanders already, and contemporaries did not treat the event as the end of anything. The Eastern Empire continued, governed from Constantinople, calling itself Roman throughout, for another 1,000 years. The 3rd century had already brought a severe crisis. Rapid turnover of emperors, most dying violently, alongside invasions, plague, currency debasement, and economic disruption. The empire was reconstituted afterwards under reforms that divided administration, expanded the bureaucracy and army, and imposed heavier taxation to pay for both. It recovered, and it recovered as a more rigid and more expensive structure. The causes proposed for the Western decline are numerous and not mutually exclusive. Fiscal pressure is central. The army and administration cost more than the tax base could sustain, and debasement of the silver coinage across the imperial period is measurable and severe. Political instability meant resources were repeatedly consumed by civil war. Pressure on the frontiers intensified, driven partly by movements of peoples further east, and groups were increasingly settled inside imperial territory as federates, which solved immediate problems and created new ones. Plague struck repeatedly, and studies of climate proxies indicate a period of instability coinciding with imperial difficulties. Historians disagree sharply about how to characterize the result. One tradition emphasizes transformation, with Roman and Germanic elements blending, elites adapting, and continuity outweighing rupture. Another points to archaeological evidence of severe material decline, pottery quality collapsing, long-distance trade contracting, stone building nearly ceasing in some regions, and argues that describing this as transformation understates a real catastrophe for ordinary people. Both positions rest on substantial evidence, and the debate is unresolved. Let's talk about the half that survived too, because leaving it out is the single largest distortion in the popular story. The Eastern Empire, governed from Constantinople, did not merely linger. It remained a major power for centuries, with a functioning tax system, a professional army, a codified body of law, and an economy that continued operating while the West fragmented. Its advantages were partly structural. The East was wealthier and more urbanized, with denser populations and more productive agriculture, particularly in Egypt and Syria. Its capital was extraordinarily defensible, sitting on a peninsula behind walls that held against repeated sieges for a very long time. And its frontier problems, while severe, were more concentrated than the long-exposed borders the West had to hold. Under Justinian in the 6th century, it attempted and partly achieved reconquest of the West, retaking Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain at enormous cost. The same reign produced a comprehensive codification of Roman law that became the foundation of legal systems across much of Europe and beyond, and it was struck by a devastating plague that appears to have undone much of what the military campaigns achieved. The empire that continued afterwards was progressively reduced by Persian wars, Arab conquests, and later pressures, contracting over centuries to the region around its capital before falling in 1453. Its inhabitants called themselves Romans throughout. The term Byzantine is a later scholarly coinage, applied by historians long afterwards, and its use has had the effect of separating in the imagination something that was continuous in fact. Let's talk about how any of this is known too, because the evidence base has particular shapes that determine what can be said. Roman history rests on written sources to an extent that earlier periods do not, and those sources have serious biases. Most surviving historical writing was produced by members of the senatorial elite, in Rome, or writing about it, frequently long after the events described, and frequently with political purposes. Accounts of emperors are shaped by whether the writer's own patrons benefited from that emperor's reputation, which is why some rulers appear as monsters in one tradition and competent administrators in another. Entire perspectives are missing. Very little survives written by anyone poor, enslaved, provincial, or female. What we know about those lives comes largely from what others wrote about them, from legal texts describing their status, and from archaeology. Archaeology has therefore reshaped the field substantially. Excavation of ordinary settlements, rubbish deposits, and cemeteries reveals diet, health, and material conditions that texts ignore. Analysis of pottery distribution maps trade in a way no written source describes. Shipwrecks preserve cargoes. Skeletal analysis indicates nutrition, disease, and physical labor. Ice cores from distant glaciers record lead and copper pollution from Roman mining and smelting, providing an independent index of economic activity that rises and falls with the historical narrative and can be dated without reference to any text. Then there are the accidents. The eruption that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum preserved two ordinary towns in a state no normal site achieves, down to graffiti on walls, food in shops, and furniture in rooms. Waterlogged deposits at a Roman fort in northern Britain preserved wooden writing tablets containing letters, duty rosters, and an invitation to a birthday party, which is close to the only surviving Roman correspondence of that kind. These finds are irreplaceable precisely because they are unrepresentative. They show what the record normally destroys. Let's talk about why it never quite ended too, because this represents something more interesting than nostalgia. Rome's political legacy was claimed repeatedly by states that had no continuous connection to it. A Frankish king was crowned emperor in Rome in 800, founding a line that eventually became the Holy Roman Empire, which persisted in various forms for 1,000 years. Russian rulers adopted the title of Caesar in a Slavic form and advanced a claim to inherit the Eastern imperial tradition after Constantinople fell. The Ottoman Sultan who took the city also claimed the Roman title, with some justification given what he had captured. The vocabulary survived everywhere. The word for emperor in German and in Russian both derive from Caesar. Republican terminology, Senate, Capitol, Forum, Tribune, was adopted enthusiastically by later states, particularly those constructing themselves as republics and looking for a precedent. The architecture of government buildings across much of the world quotes Roman forms deliberately, columns and pediments and domes, because those forms had come to signify legitimacy and permanence. Roman law had the deepest practical afterlife. The codification produced under Justinian was rediscovered and studied intensively in medieval Italian universities, and it became the foundation of the civil law tradition that governs much of continental Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia and Africa today. Concepts developed by Roman jurists about contracts, property, obligation, and legal personality remain in daily use in courtrooms that have no other connection to antiquity. That persistence is worth noticing for what it says about the original question. An empire that supposedly fell has been continuously invoked, imitated, and claimed for 1,500 years by people who wanted whatever it had, which is a strange fate for something that ended. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Rome rose because it did something almost no ancient state did. It absorbed its enemies into its own citizen body, which gave it manpower reserves nobody could match and let it lose battles indefinitely without losing wars. That structural advantage, combined with a military culture emphasizing engineering, discipline, and logistics, converted a minor Italian city into a Mediterranean power over several centuries. The Republic then failed because its institutions were built for a city and were governing an empire, with conquest wealth concentrating in few hands, professional armies attaching to individual commanders, and political norms collapsing into civil war. Augustus resolved that by concentrating power while preserving appearances, producing 2 centuries of relative stability. The decline in the West came from many pressures acting together on a structure with diminishing capacity to absorb them: fiscal strain, currency debasement, repeated civil war, frontier pressure, plague, and climatic instability, with 476 marking an administrative formality rather than a collapse. Meanwhile, the eastern half continued for another millennium. which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. The thing that made Rome unstoppable was a willingness to make its enemies into Romans. And the empire that resulted lasted so long that the people arguing about when it ended still cannot agree on a date.